I believe we're rolling.
No, why are we rolling? What are we talking about? It's a terrible way to begin. We got stuff on here.
All right, I'm finally at the debate table, the discussion table with my good brother Ahneeahm Ben Khazriel. You know what I mean? I mean, this brother has really reshaped my spiritual and or religious that D word.
Development?
Nah, bro. You gotta change your paradigm. It wasn't. I think paradigm was what I really.
That's not. So that's a P. That's definitely a P word.
You're right, bro. You're right. But you know.
Obviously, I still got some more work to do with this. You know what I mean? But we're gonna help him out.
But you know, he's really changed a lot of my outlook on a lot of things. Before it was I would say ignorant to an extent, but it was also limited, and he had no issue, you know, sharing what he knew and his understanding to kind of help me broaden my understanding about, you know, certain outlooks that I had before that was actually limiting me from being as effective as I am even up to this day, even in the works that we're carrying out right now. A lot of it has to do with my brother right here, and even his expertise comes from a line of people who just ascended menial means of getting by spiritually, that have ascended to a place where they're now taking command and dominion of their spirituality. Now, would you say so?
Yes.
Is there anything you'd like to add?
Absolutely. Shalom again. My name is Ahneeahm Ben Khazriel. I'm an instructor in the School of the Prophets Institute, where Brother Yonatan here is one of my top students. And I come from a unique background. First of all, as a high school dropout, I was one of those who I loved learning, but I hated school. So I can relate to a lot of other people who are in that situation, because oftentimes we find that the school system isn't nourishing us the way that we need for it to nourish us. And it was, I was going a certain kind of way in life until I began studying Hebraic thought, which taught me not only about the world around me, but also what's going on inside of me, all at the same time. This sparked a sort of transformation, which over the course of the years, through my studying the Hebraic paradigm, as you were trying to say.
Yeah, there you go.
Not successfully, but you got there eventually. You know, I was able to transform the way that I was thinking and develop a whole new platform for my scholarly foundation, because I was already interested in studying things from around the world. I was studying world religion, I was studying African history, I was studying black nationalism, but it was disconnected bits of information that weren't really interwoven into a solid, comprehensible framework. Yeah, so I was just studying stuff and quoting stuff, you know, without really understanding it, much less knowing how it applies. But by being able to stop, go back and understudy, learn in the School of the Prophets for years, I was able to get a scholarly foundation that was rooted and that was strong. And then from that foundation, I was able to branch back out later. After years of training and, you know, all kind of interesting experiences along the way, I was able to branch back out and begin to reanalyze African history, to reanalyze world religion, to be able to reanalyze the Bible, you know, and all these different things from a new truth-centered point of view. And that truth-centered point of view is what we work to promote in the School of the Prophets Institute. So it's a holistic, regenerative, and purposeful way to analyze scripture, history, political science, etc.
Okay. And since you brought up School of the Prophets, which is a institution within the KOY ministry, and one of the qualms that I see a lot of people may have is they don't fully understand the KOY's position on Jesus, aka Yeshua. And it wasn't until I actually sat down and, you know, was able to dialogue with many members of the KOY that I realized Yeshua is very much so embraced, but you guys work to dispel the myth surrounding him that the Euro-Gentile has used to gain control and political power, that this is Christianity has become a political tool used to wield America's prowess in the different governments around the world.
Yes.
And, you know, me and you got into the conversation about Daniel and the 70 weeks, you know, him being the Messiah of that passage. And how that applies, you know, that's part of KOI doctrine. How do you feel that it's properly appropriated within the KOI? How is this taught unto the people?
Well, one of the things we got to be very clear about is that we deliberately weren't taught to think in terms of civilization. right? We were given a very particular worldview and way to approach all things, which obviously it hasn't been working for us, and so it's very relevant that you mentioned the word political, how Christianity was a political tool, because many of the most key figures in the history of Christianity were, in fact, politicians. Remember, it was the Roman Emperor Constantine, right?
Yes.
Who commissioned the Council of Nicaea, where organized 300 Christian bishops from around the Roman Empire to come together and formulate the new socio-religious doctrine which would characterize the state. It was King James who sanctioned the creation of a new translation of the Bible. And you can go into so many other key areas, right? Ptolemy in Egypt was the Greek, essentially Pharaoh, who reigned after Alexander conquered that region. And it was that individual who commissioned the creation of the Greek Septuagint, right? Which was the first European translation of the Bible. So why do you have so many key monarchs, political statesmen, international diplomats, representatives of government interested in theology? Because this is a politicized mythology. In former times, there wasn't this concept of the separation between church and state. Why is that important? Because the idea of Messiah is the ancient Hebraic concept of leadership itself. It's the ancient Hebraic concept of leadership, and it's connected to psychological, social, political, economic positions, which have to be fulfilled in order for the people to experience prosperity. So if you're working to construct a civilization, a social order, a way of life, right, a government, and you have here this document which outlines the requirements of leadership, it's central to the affairs of that government that you define leadership in a way that's relative to your objectives.
I agree.
And this is why so many European politicians were involved, and why the concept of Christianity was so central to the emergence of Western civilization. Because they came forth with innovative new definitions and concepts and standards of what it means to govern on earth as God.
Ooh. So that means that they get to define, they get the power.
They seize the power to define God's government on earth. So we have to broaden our perspective beyond just the world of theology.
Indeed.
Because the theologians who created the world that we're talking about weren't really interested in theology. They were interested in government. They were interested in social science. They were interested in macroeconomics.
Yes.
They were interested in transforming agricultural land policies in Africa from communally shared to land ownership. There's so many different components built into this thing that just to analyze it from a religious standpoint is entirely insufficient. So the Messiah is the ancient Hebraic concept of leadership. And when you go back, you have to reconstruct the whole worldview surrounding the institution of leadership from a Hebraic perspective. So the scriptures are very useful in that regard. And when you go back to put these things into context, you would obviously go back to the fact that there was actually a time before, in the Hebraic narrative, in the scriptures, there was a time before government as we knew it existed, right? Because it's after the flood that we see the emergence of the socio-political systems of the world today, right? There was a new geopolitical social order born after the flood.
All right, so we're talking about the geopolitical social order of the ancient world. And I'm here once again with Ahneeahm Ben Khazriel, and we're going to pick up where we left off. Go ahead, Soch.
So, the Bible is self-conscious of historical themes that predate the writing of the Bible. And this is reflected through the first several chapters of Genesis. Also, as a matter of fact, the whole book of Genesis is reflecting a time period before the Bible itself was written. And so what it's doing is the Bible is grounding itself in a broader historical and political framework. Much of what we're reading about is the transformations of the political scene in that region, and the challenges that were posed by those that were seeking to live there. When Abraham and his family first moved into Canaan, one of the first realizations was, man, there's not enough resources for all of us in this small space, So we got to split up. So we need to form whatever type of social system we create, it has to be decentralized. We can't all try to center ourselves in one area and exploit the resources there, because it's going to create conflict between us. So in the book of Genesis, it says, let there be no strife between us. You go over there, I'll go over there. All right, so decentralization there is seen as a key to prosperity, right? Because you just spread out the resources and you share. And this is very indigenous. You find this in many countries and cultures around the world. But it also leads to problems, because Lot was separated from Abraham. He eventually gets kidnapped. By who? By powerful city-states. who then kidnap him and bring him into their world of immorality from a Hebraic standpoint. They might have saw it as progressive and liberal, you know? Yeah. But, you know, from a Hebraic standpoint, man, there was some other stuff going on in there, you know? So the Bible is constantly laying out these themes that go into Egypt. And now it's not just we're going into Egypt, it's how are we going to interface with the leadership, right? Based on the differences in morality. So this is an exploration of diplomacy and international relations and understanding cross-cultural dynamics, which actually, just a reading of the text makes it seem like he actually misperceived the character of the nation that he was going into. Which means two things. Number one, it's possible to misperceive, right, the character of the nation that you're going into. Number two, it's also possible that nations create bad reputations for themselves. You see what I mean? And so both of these factors are probably at work with that story, because he was talking about ancient Egypt. And ancient Egypt was one of many powerful social systems which governed the Holy Land, right, from the Nile to the Euphrates, northeastern Africa, also known as the Middle East, or the Near East. Ancient Egypt was one. Assyria was another. Babylon, Persia, Greece, Rome. These types of civilizations are founded on concepts of morality, theological concepts, which influence the political systems, which led humanity to a very dark place. So all of that context is being laid out, even to the point of saying that this family has to leave and go into Egypt just looking for, you know, a better life, just looking for some more resources and to not be in a famine. Because the place that had all the resources was over there. So they go to the place that had the resources to sustain themselves. Little did they know, you know, there was an entirely different experience awaiting them there, you know, because this was the characteristic of the powerful agrarian civilizations, particularly river valley civilizations of that era. So by the time you get to the Exodus, all of this political history has already been laid out. All of this essential context has already been illustrated. And you should get the idea that there was a need for a new world to be born. There was a need for an alternative to the standard of development which was in place at that time. Then you get to the idea of the need for a new type of law to govern the land. Remember, the Israelites weren't called out of Egypt to become extensions of the Egyptian culture somewhere else. They were called out to represent a new idea. Neither were they to integrate into the Canaanite paradigm or to replicate the Mesopotamian system of governance. So the Torah was this framework or this constitutional law which had a different set of morals at its foundation. So some of the basic principles that you read in there were things like, don't glean your vineyard. Don't be greedy. So if you produce in abundance, don't strip the vine of every single berry and put it in your bucket and walk away. It says you can take from your vineyard, but leave some for the poor, for the fatherless, for the widow, right? And so on and so forth. For the oppressed, like have a concept, a consciousness of sharing. And this is a value. It's not a religious idea. That's just a value of what's the best way to build a social system. Yes. Based off greed and self-centeredness, or based on cooperation. It doesn't... And benevolence. And it doesn't infringe upon individuals' ability to accumulate wealth. It says, no, you planted the stuff, accumulate, you know, but save and preserve and allow another ethic to be in place when it comes to providing for those less fortunate than you. That's built into the law of the land. Very significant. Then you go into other ones, you know, not charging interest, making sure that you can't be a perpetual slave, so on and so forth. So it's in that context that we have to view this idea of Torah historically. For those who are comfortable moving beyond just the religious interpretation and going into the more of the historical and political science of the scriptures, it's a revolutionary form of ancient Hebraic communalism to build a community founded on spiritual principles, while surrounded by nations founded on other principles. Gotcha. Put it like that, other principles, and which made it challenging. So from that point forward, the historical narrative is highlighting the challenges of the people who were supposed to be governed according to that idea. And the question is, can you build a righteous society in a wicked world? The answer is, man, it's very difficult. It's very difficult because in the Bible you have different books, right? You got the book of Kings twice, the book of Chronicles twice. So you get a very good historical overview of northern and southern kingdom politics. Yeah. Neither one of them paint a good picture of the standard for leadership at that time.
Wow. That's probably why it's so hard to focus in on a good man in the scripts.
Exactly. And this is why, because again, you asked about the idea of Yeshua and why he's so important. But we're putting it back in perspective because the ideal of Messiah is the ancient Hebraic concept and standard for leadership.
Hallelujah.
The idea of Messiah in Hebrew, Mashiach, is the anointed one. All of the kings of Israel were anointed into office. But again, before we can talk about the ideal of Messiah, we got to talk about where it came from. Right? So, who remembers 2 Samuel chapter 8? No. 1 Samuel chapter 8. The evolution of Israelite nationalism.
Is that when the temple was established? Or if these people... Okay.
Before.
Okay.
Right? This was when the people rejected Samuel's leadership and the prior system of Hebraic communalism, right, during what was called the period of the judges, and then they opted for a monarchy. So this is, again, it's a political transformation. Like, you can, for some reason, decide to just focus on the fact that the word Lord is used in capital letters and say this is a religious document. But these are essentially essays in political philosophy, right? And it's saying that the people had developed a political orientation and desire and preference for a king like the other nations around them, right? So they were observing a different method of statecraft, saying there's another way we can build society other than a small-scale model. And the two particular points that were mentioned was economics and military defense, right? Like, these are the areas where we'll get the benefits. Samuel the prophet was concerned. He was concerned because, like, wait a second, we might get those things, but we'll lose something in the process. We'll lose something as we begin to pattern our societies after the societies that are around us. You see what I mean? What we'll lose is the soul of our people. So then he goes on to say, after, getting his divine consultation, here's the manner of the king who will govern you. And then he starts listing attributes. But the key from a historical perspective, that these attributes of kingship were common from the Nile to the Euphrates.
Yeah, he's going to turn your sons and daughters into confectionaries and make his sons lead the processions or stuff like that. Like,
what's going to happen is the family will lose its sovereignty. I'm pointing at you. The family will lose its sovereignty as you opt to make the king the national sovereign. And now he will strip power from the independent families so to support the institution of the kingship. Now, the benefits from that is the basic benefits of nationalism. When you scale up and build that type of civilization, you can produce so much more. Like, for example, if you go back historically, just to your average African village, or Asian village, Indian, wherever, the biggest idea is that individuals build families. Here's the political evolutionary ladder, so to speak. Individuals build families. Families congregate into tribes. Tribes, if they become sedentary, establish villages. Villages can grow on to become towns and cities, right? Because you've centralized the population, they start developing more into towns and cities. Now, if you build a big city, especially if you got solid defense, that means you obviously have some key resources, some strategic resources that are able to keep people in the same place for a long time. Cities can become headquarters for the emergence of nations, countries. Remember, when David became king, he had to establish a capital city, Jerusalem. It's all political. So now nations, countries, can confluent or can converge together to form empires. And in the history of the so-called Middle East, prior to the emergence of the kingdom of Israel, you already had other empires on the scene. Large empires, large nations, much more powerful towns and cities. And then here in Israel, you have some small little villages and communities. And they were saying, we don't want to be villages, we want to be like them guys. Give me a king to be like them other guys. And it's like, okay, now, you might be looking at the end result that they've experienced, and you want the military and economic prowess. But there's some spiritual things that will be lost. The family loses its significance, and power gets centralized at the headquarters. The people are like, yeah, that's what we want. And so the journey begins. Now, it's a new era in Israelite history. It's a new era in the spiritual narrative
of the Hebrews,
of our people. Because now, the success or failure of the people, more so than at any other time, it depends upon righteous leadership. The blessings or curses of the nation is largely dependent upon the alignment of the king. So when you go into the books of Kings, into the books of Chronicles, and you find all these wicked kings, it's letting you know it's a challenge.
with a few okay.
And every once in a while, like the ratio is real tilted. There's way more wicked kings than was righteous kings.
Yeah.
And the standard for righteousness and wickedness was based on the example of David. Because the way to be written is, this so-and-so did according to the ways of David, his father, and so-and-so did not according to the way. He did evil in the sight of the Lord.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
We good?
Yeah. I don't know.
We'll just keep going. So why am I saying all of this? Because if you go into the book of Deuteronomy, the laws concerning the king, there was foresight into the fact that development might take place.
Indeed.
You know? And that the people might want a king to be like the other nations. But that king was supposed to study the Torah.
Yes.
He was supposed to know the constitutional standards that were supposed to guide the development of the nation. And those standards would have provided a safeguard against corruption, against economic exploitation, against abuse and deceit, against overt militarism. You see what I mean? Internal or external captivities and invasions. Like there were principles of social development built into that. But what you find in the books of Kings and Chronicles is that's not the development, that's not the standard, that's not the way that those kings were governed in their land. They totally disregarded those principles and they opted for the spiritual and political standards of the nations around them. So it's talking about this struggle, this nationalistic struggle now, because now you got yourself a kingdom, you got yourself a monarchy. But it's a nationalistic struggle to secure the best interests of the people. The prophets came along onto the scene, not as extensions of the power of the king, and not as blind followers of the masses of the people, but as people who would look at the principles of truth and righteousness and evaluate everybody's progress or regression from that perspective. So the prophets would be unafraid to say to the people, y'all crazy. And to the kings, y'all ain't doing that right. Prophets gave advice on military affairs. Don't go to war with this king. Don't do this. Because they aligned everything in society according to the principles of truth and righteousness. Biblically expressed as, the will of the Lord, things of that nature. So in Deuteronomy chapter, what did I say it was? Chapter 4? No, it wasn't chapter 4. Whichever one I just mentioned. Can't believe I just forgot it that quick. 17? Verses 14 through 20. The laws concerning the king. I know it's verses 14 through 20.
Okay.
But it's highlighting the ideal form of nationalistic leadership. And when you take that form and you apply it to the leaders of Israel, you see that many of them were falling short of the mark. So the concept of Messiah, Mashiach, is the concept of the leader of Israel regardless. Every single king of Israel was HaMashiach. That's just a historical fact because all of them were the anointed king of Israel. That's true whether they were good or bad. That means that there were wicked messiahs. It's a deep concept because Messiah in the modern world, Messiah has become synonymous with one individual. Yeah. Such was not the case in ancient times. You see what I mean? Messiah was whoever the one individual was that was on the throne at that time, which included even the wicked kings. But you can see that this creates a situation where righteous leadership is so important. Because righteous leadership, it says when the blind lead the blind, they both fall into the pit. Who you're being led by, therefore, is relative to where you're going. You see what I mean? Yeah. It's relative to where you're going. So, if we took a few examples, before we get to Yeshua, we took a few examples of Israelite leadership. Let's start at the top with David. Let's fast forward from David, because we know he did some crazy things, man. Like, it's so funny because you would think that the Bible
will paint the nice picture.
Like, everybody was so good, but it says some people did some shady stuff, man. You know why it says those things? Because people do shady stuff across all levels of society. So it shouldn't seem weird to us when we go into the books like Psalms, which are attributed to David, King David. Yes. And it says, do not put your trust in kings and in princes, nor in the Son of Man. Right? Yeah. Like, he's talking about himself. Because all of us, we're fleshy, like we mess up. Don't put all of your trust in us. Put your trust in something higher than us. So the Hebraic science of leadership is saying that there's a difference between having God as king and the king as God. Does that make sense? I mean, forgive me for the use of the word God. Right, I got you. But the difference between, because if your king is God, then you can't go higher than that. So wherever he's at on the scale is where you're going to fall down to. But even in the Psalms, which again came from the leadership to the people, it was like, make sure you never get too caught up looking at me as an individual. It's really about who I'm serving. There's a superordinate principle above me that I'm subordinate to. This is expressed in Psalms 23 in more practical terms. The Lord is my shepherd. Yahweh the Lord is my shepherd. I'm a sheep myself. I'm a follower. I'm a student. I'm a servant of something greater than me. And because I'm aligned with that higher principle, I'm blessed in all these different ways. So David was the sheep. If the Lord is his shepherd, David is the sheep or the lamb of the Most High. This wasn't invented in the New Testament. That terminology is ancient Hebraic terminology. David saying, I'm the lamb. But to the people, David was the shepherd. So this is the idea of the leader as the servant. So the idea of servant leadership is, again, what the Hebraic system or standard of leadership was about. And you can see that from David, who had his ups and downs. See, he was not a pure person. He was actually prevented from certain developments because of his own impurities.
Yes.
So that he couldn't build the temple. That would have to go to another generation to do that which he and his generation couldn't do.
Wow.
Solomon had to build the temple.
Yes.
So now Solomon's the man, right? Maybe he's going to usher in and bring in the next wave of salvation for the people.
And we know how that ends, ladies and gentlemen.
One of the biggest things with King Solomon was the building of the temple. And in the process of building of the temple, he exacted heavy taxes on the people. And they had to import cedar from Lebanon, and they had to do this, and they had to do this. He was painting with gold and all this fancy stuff. He's courting fine Ethiopian sisters to come up and all that type of stuff, and leaving them with babies. I mean, King Solomon is living it up. The Bible's kind of focused on his little narrative, right?
Yeah.
But also, keep in mind, at that same time, there's still the rest of the society. And in the rest of the society, they're not experiencing all those economic benefits that Solomon was experiencing in the palace. They're like, we're still struggling. It's still a desert, relatively speaking. We're still eking out a meager existence, trying to keep our families in order and stave off invaders and stuff like that. And you having a great time up there in your palace, bro. But what about us? Our whole existence is to serve and benefit you. This is creating tension. So even while the biblical narrative is focused on the higher ups, you still got to keep in mind that the people, it's all about the people. It's never not been about anything other than the people.
Yeah.
And so the greatness of the king is measured by his greatness according to the people. Just like the greatness of a shepherd is known by the greatness of his sheep. The greatness of a king is known by the greatness of his kingdom. So that doesn't really come back to bite Solomon in his time. Who does that fall on? His son. Because now Rehoboam comes into power. And when he comes into power, he's the son of the king. He's the king. He's the third generation of a monarchy. He was privileged. He was born into wealth and power. But he was also born with the social division and stratification that the previous generations of kings who were trying to be kings like the other nations, right? The social stratification which was created as a result of that is what Rehoboam inherits, because the people see that he's young and they say, yo, we can deal with him, maybe. Maybe we can negotiate and fix this problem. So they bring their representatives to him and they say, hey, look, check it out. We'll follow you because you represent David and the Lord and all, you're the Messiah. You're the man. We'll follow you. We'll serve you. We will be in your kingdom. You won't have no problems with us if you kind of change some of these policies which your daddy put in place. Rehoboam's like, interesting. He goes into his corner. He gets his advice, right? 2 sets of advice. First one from the elders. The elders say you should listen to the people.
You're a servant.
Yeah, the purpose of the leader is to listen to the people. It's, and they're asking for something that's righteous. Maybe the elders read the Torah. And they knew that it was about the needs of the people. And they knew that Solomon was kind of being a little bit extravagant. Because even in Solomon's writings in Ecclesiastes, you see that he was kind of dejected. And towards the end, he's like, it's all vanity. It's all vanity. He learned the hard way. But his son had to deal with the effects of that vanity. So now the son is like, okay, I hear what the elders are saying. Listen to the people. Let me see my friends think. He asks his friends say, man, screw the people. You the king. Tell them that your little finger and all that.
Bigger than your father's loins.
Yeah, they hit him with this. You can see the sense of hyper masculinity. You see what I mean? This egotistical masculinity concept that factors in. Masculinity isn't bad, but that brand of it is.
It is.
And it's what made him want to crush the spirit of the people and overexert his political authority. He was a king like the other nations, which Israel was not supposed to be like. So what happens is the people defect. 10 tribes to the north, 2 tribes to the south. You know that story, right? The split of the nation of Israel was because of leadership. Why is that important? Because, matter of fact, it was so serious. The king, in his arrogance, still thought that he ran the show. So he sent a tax collector out to the northern tribes like, yeah, y'all still gonna give me this money. You know, people better have my money. They sent his body back. With no breath of life in it. Like, look, we got our own thing. They elected their own new king. I think the capital was Samaria. Opened up a new temple, a new religious system, everything. The nation split in half. It was civil war was brewing. Oh. And so now the scriptures from that point, they now you got to deal with history from that point forward being the history of a divided kingdom. Remember, all these people in the beginning were brothers. It was a family, which just grew larger. But as they grew larger and bigger, in all of that, they lost the soul, which kept the nation together. Mm-hmm. This is the idea behind the Tower of Babel. They were building and building and building, and what happens is that stuff gets crushed and brought right back down to the ground. Mm-hmm. This is what was happening with the fall of the nation of Israel. So, from that point forward, the story is clear. The rise of various priests, prophets, messiahs, trying to recorrect, readjust, get the people back in harmony with the will of their ancestors. Moses, Samuel, Abraham, Elijah, etc. But it's an up and down struggle until eventually Assyria comes along, other nations come along, and you get this scenario where now the Greeks done invaded, the Romans took over, and now you arrive around the turn of the millennium, right? Mm-hmm. And it's in that context that we have to begin the discussion about the reemergence of Messianic leadership. Because it's with full consideration of the intergenerational legacy of corrupt Israelite leaders that we have to focus in on this character called Yeshua. Mm. One of his policy positions, when he begins campaigning for national leadership in the midst of the downtrodden children of Israel, was, think not that I've come to destroy the law and the prophets.
No, I came to fulfill.
Mm-hmm. But the real question is, why would he have to say that?
Yeah.
Why would a Hebrew spiritual leader, political leader, revolutionary leader, whatever, however you want to paint the picture, why would it even be relevant to say that I haven't come to destroy the teachings of the prophets and the laws of Moses? That's our foundation as a people. Mm-hmm. That should be irrelevant. That's like saying, that's like the president campaigning. Don't get it twisted and think that I'm trying to destroy the Constitution.
Yeah.
Like, who's trying to destroy the Constitution? I mean, we're going to talk about that. But the idea is that everybody who's trying to be a leader of this people builds on the foundation of the ancestors of this people.
Yeah.
But that just wasn't the case. There was actually an entire legion of sellout Israelite leaders prior to.
Indeed.
Who were in bed with the Greeks and the Romans, and who were actively involved in the process of destroying the law and the prophets. So one of Yeshua's policy positions was distinguishing his leadership from theirs.
Indeed.
Think not that I'm like them Negroes. You see what I mean? Who are on that side of the fence. I'm trying to resurrect and apply and manifest and fulfill those teachings in this generation at this time. Revolutionary concept. Same time, Caesar is the son of God in Rome. Mm-hmm. He's like, nope, we're redefining that concept, bringing it back to the Hebraic idea. And it's a whole conversation about all of the different elements of Hebraic thought and nationalistic ethos built into Yeshua's ministry. Mm-hmm. But the point that I would like to emphasize is that what Yeshua illustrates, more so than any of the other kings of Israel, was the law of the king outlined in the Torah. I should say more so than any of the kings of Israel that I'm familiar with and I can think of right now. Yeah. You see what I mean? But the fact that he didn't sit on a formal throne, didn't rule and reign and administrate over a large government, things of that nature, obviously, first of all, because he was so young, just a few years older than me, you know what I mean? Put that in context, very young man,
a few years older than us.
Yeah, very ambitious. It probably started off at about our age.
Yeah.
And so it's like, he didn't move into the corridors of power with all of its trappings. So we didn't get to see what that would look like. Because he was obviously in nation building mode. It was a revolutionary movement, which at its fullness, the biggest application of it would have to be restoration of sovereign Hebraic government in the land, no longer being under the Roman rule. It just wasn't to be at that time. But the key is that he was developing other leaders, you know what I mean? And training and empowering them to be the new people. But the winds, of change had swept aside that era in history. It wasn't the time for Israelite nationalism to become reestablished in that part of the world yet. So how Yeshua fits into all of this is that he exemplified the principles of servant leadership that have been forgotten by so many of the Hebrew prophets or Hebrew messiahs. Even the prophets. Many of the prophets was wicked. Yeah. Not the inspired prophets of Israel that we, glamorize, but there were 300 lying prophets of King Ahab, I believe it was. 300, and there was just one who told the truth, Micaiah. And then one time, when he did tell the truth, he got smacked and thrown in prison, So the political and religious institutions, religion has always been a powerful tool to mobilize and organize society. The Bible doesn't dispute that. It just emphasizes the fact that it's very often used to mobilize and organize society incorrectly. The Bible is very self-conscious about that.
Yeah.
The biblical perspective is not the perspective of the kings and the most powerful people. In many instances, you'll find it's the perspective of their harshest critics. Because, if I was a king, I wouldn't want people to write about me the way the prophets wrote about the kings of Israel. And he did evil in the sight of why had he do evil in the sight of the Lord?
You gonna write that? You gonna write that in the chronicle history?
I'm redacting. If I was gonna redact anything, all these people talking about redaction, I would have redacted them whole books. I would have just rewrote the whole thing. So but it's nah, man. Yeshua came onto the scene and re-imaged the whole idea of messianic leadership, and one of the key points, again, was this idea of him as the Lamb, which is why I wanted to explain that the concept of the Lamb was tied into. It's one of the many epithets, many titles, the whole nomenclature surrounding leadership. Lamb is one of the words that are used, shepherd, gardener, king. All these are just different terms that are used to encapsulate a function in society. And the way that Yeshua demonstrates that in what is referred to as the New Testament is phenomenal. It's phenomenal. It's very, very important because when you place it against the broader context of Roman government, which is very similar to Euro-American world government, if you look at the history of oppressed and indigenous people worldwide fighting for liberation, if you look at the soul transformation of oppressed and colonized people, and then you just factor in all those principles, from admittedly from what they call the Greek scriptures. Yeah. But you have to, if you just extract those principles, even if you think it's mythology and it's made up. I saw some deep stuff in Game of Thrones, and I was like, that was deep. Yeah. There were some deep things in Black Panther and Wakanda about brothers fighting and egotism. T'Challa could have just told everybody else to leave the room and said, brother, what's going on? Tell me your story. You'd have to go through this huge loop, and then eventually you find out the story. Yeah. Everybody else leave. This is between me and him. All right, I'm the king. Let's talk.
I'm going to check this one more time. I don't trust this. Oh, it's actually hanging in there. So you're at 30 minutes. And I know you have way more. This is why I'm winding down. This is like the teaser for what he's able to expound on in School of the Prophets. So I think you got to your ramp up this. You narrowed it in a great way. So I want you to go into the books you brought here as we come to a close. Yeah. So this whole idea of reevaluating the scriptures from this truth-centered point of view, it isn't something that I created. Indeed. You see what I mean? I'm continuing on with a scholarly tradition, which was pioneered by people that came before me, and foremost among them is Rabbi Ben Ahneeahm. Yes. And these two books here outline many of the points that I was making. Why do you feel that Ben Ahneeahm is such a controversial figure in the Hebrew community? Because there's some that love him and there's some that hate him. A big part of it is, again, the devastating impact of theology. This religion thing is deep. Even if we go back, misinterpretations of the Bible or varying interpretations of the Bible have impacted our political psychology of the people. It inspired Martin Luther King to go out, and after you get hit in this, you turn out that you get hit in that face. Just the way a particular verse, there's people who died because of that interpretation of that verse. Yes. And then Denmark Vesey, the slave rebellion leader, was teaching from the same Bible that we're the Israelites, those are the other people, we got to kill the slave masters. And so the biblical hermeneutics shapes psychology in so many different ways. And understandably, there are a variety of different ways that people have interpreted the Bible as time has went on, particularly as it relates to this ideal of Messiah. It's a very controversial word. It's a very sensitive word. It's very near and dear to people's hearts. And they're very correct to be concerned
about the application of that word in today's society, right? Even because the scriptures warn us against such things,
Indeed.
you know? And so, for a variety of reasons, partly because of the differences in understanding about what a Messiah is, right? Mm-hmm. Also because of the lack of direct communication and allowing second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh parties define the first party for you. Also, we'll be remiss if we didn't mention egotism and competition and strife.
Yes.
And it could also be the case that there were those who misrepresented the teachings at a certain dispensation in time, you know, or behaved dishonorably and therefore shaped perceptions incorrectly. Like, there's a variety of reasons why these kinds of misunderstandings and things can exist. But our objective in this generation is to elevate beyond those.
True.
Because that, whatever those explanations are, they're just not sufficient for us to remain frozen in time forever with the same.
And they haven't borne the fruit that they should bear, so that we can see that this understanding bears fruit and can deliver us from.
Right. And probably, I would venture to say, the number one reason why there's such controversy surrounding the idea of Ben Ahneeahm is that people actually have no idea who he is.
Indeed.
They have no idea what he's done. They have there's no documented that they've read, you know, which gave them insight into the body of work. So they're just going based on theological understandings. My effort is to help shift our perspective beyond just the realm of theology. We can factor that in somewhere. But we have to be able to see the whole picture of being able to take a people from one part of the world to another part of the world and initiate a transformation of those people from where we came from to where we're going. And then the type of international developments which are taking place from there, opening up an entirely new chapter in the history of our people.
Indeed.
You know, you've been to Israel. You know?
Yeah.
That's usually the best medicine.
It
Is to go up and see it for yourself and hear and apply. You know, so there's a variety of reasons why it would be controversial, but one of the first steps to breaking down those barriers is to actually access this understanding, to read. And so these two books that I brought here, because you said you want to talk about this idea of Messiah, I said, well, I'm gonna bring in the authority, you know, on the topic. And so this one here is Yeshua the Hebrew Messiah, or Jesus the Christian Christ. And it poses this in the form of a question. Yeshua the Hebrew Messiah, or Jesus the Christian Christ. And I always go back to the story of when, I believe it was Jehovah's Witnesses came to my door, and they asked me, is Jesus Christ my Lord and Savior? And I said, which Jesus Christ are you talking about? And they said, Jesus Christ of the New Testament. I said, okay, I understand, but I'm only asking because there's so many different versions of Jesus out here nowadays. I don't know which one you're referring to, you know? Because the fact is that there's a Protestant Jesus, which is different than the Catholic Jesus. And the Catholic Jesus of the Western Church isn't the same as the Greek Orthodox Church, you know, the Eastern Church.
Yeah.
Then you have all these different other subdivisions within Christianity, including Afrocentric varieties, Chinese varieties, Indian versions that merged him, like Hare Krishna movement. You got atheist conceptions of Jesus. Egyptology got its own stance. Muslims have their position. So even though you could be using that word, you might not be referring to the same thing as your neighbor or the other person who's in your group. So I deliberately said that because, not to be combative, but I said that because there are different perspectives on this topic. And one of the first things that happened, he said, well, which Jesus do you believe in? I said, well, the thing that I believe is important is to distinguish between the Jesus of theology and the Jesus of history. Yeah. And the reason why that's important is because the Jesus of theology keeps changing. Mm-hmm. There are over 40,000 different denominations of Christianity alone. With all of them, they got a different Jesus. So I can't just go based on them. I want to go back to the Jesus of history. And one of the first things you find out when you learn about the Jesus of history is that his name wasn't Jesus.
There you go.
You see what I mean? And so now we have to distinguish between the Eurocentric theological construct called Jesus Christ and all of the baggage that comes along with that idea, and the ancient Hebraic revolutionary leader, Yeshua the Hebrew Messiah. And so this book goes in depth into those topics. And then that's part one. Then there's a part two, which is even more comprehensive as an analytical study guide. This book here, goes into the ecumenical councils that shaped the redefinitions of the idea of Jesus over the years, with a special emphasis on between the years of 325 and 787 ACE. What happened in 325?
325. I'm just gonna guess that you're talking about the Council of Nicaea.
The Council of Nicaea. So a lot of people are familiar with the Council of Nicaea, and the idea is that the Council of Nicaea was when they created Jesus. Like that's the popular way it's articulated. You know, it's not necessarily true, but there's a lot of truth in it. You know, but the Council of Nicaea was just the first of 7 ecumenical councils between 325 and 787, which collectively created what's called Orthodox Christianity.
Yeah.
You see what I mean? It was preceded by other the Council of Trent. You know, 787 was Council of Nicaea 2. And then there were still more councils where they were like really coming together, congregating in the sides of the north, trying to figure out, you know what I mean, how they're going to define, is Jesus, he's the Son of God? Is it consubstantiality? Is it this? Is he the flesh? Whose Arius? What's he talking about? Get rid of him, he's excommunicated. Anybody who talks like that again is going to be banned from the church. You know, like, it was this political period of politicians gathering together religious leaders to figure out how they were going to define the idea of God through Jesus. And the end result of those meetings is Orthodox Christianity and the Nicene Creed, which grew out of that, and the other liturgical documents and declarations of faith. They survived the Protestant Revolution. So the bulk of Protestantism isn't against the core elements that were established at this time. And Protestantism encompasses your Lutherans, your Baptists, you know, all these different branches. Some who are conscious of it, you know, they're like, hey, the Nicene Creed has some stuff wrong. But generally speaking, the vast majority of the over 1 billion people on the planet who identify as Christians, they are influenced directly by the outcomes of those meetings which are outlined in this book. And he actually has the transcripts from those meetings. And when you read them, you would be like, oh, that's why I believe this. Oh, they came up with this in 415. Oh, this came from so-and-so. Interesting. I mean, everything from the origins of Easter. Easter was directly created to create a contradiction to Pesach. Constantine said it himself. So it would be the term he used was odious. You know, but he said, like, basically Constantine's logic was, what kind of people what kind of empire enslaves another people, conquers their land, destroys their institutions, and then worships their God? And lets their God tell us what holidays to serve. He said, there's no way we're going to follow the Jews' holiday of Passover, even though we're Christians. Documented, research Constantine and Easter.
Look, wow.
So these books, they're revolutionary because they break open this whole world of theology and politics and history and social science together, make it very, very simple and easy to understand. You'll be able to see the role of the Dead Sea Scrolls in all of this. You'll be able to see the Greek invasions. Why were the scriptures translated from Hebrew to Greek? Who studied them while they were in Greek? What about the Latin Vulgate by Jerome? What about King James? How does all this tie into the history of colonialism and slavery? How does this influence the psychology of black people today in Africa and around the world? All these things are presented in a very simple, very clear, very easy to understand manner. You know, so I would recommend people start off with this, because this one here is kind of heavy. You got to be ready for it. You know what I mean? But you start off with this, and it'll give you introduction into a whole new world of thinking. And if you like what I'm saying, just imagine what my teacher said, you know, because I'm just a student. So with that, I think I'll close out my little spiel.
I appreciate that, man. I appreciate that. And I look forward to working with you some more in the future. As we've been doing, set a good habit of working together this last year, 2018.
Oh, yeah.
And getting used to one another and seeing what our mannerisms are, where our strengths are, where we can still work, and being realistic with what we can expect from one another. And I think we can continue to build and, you know, revolutionize the thought process of our generation.
Absolutely.
And pre-established works of the forefathers.
Absolutely. All those who came before us, we have to build on the foundation that's been laid before us. You know, sometimes you don't got to reinvent the wheel. You can redecorate it. You can redesign it. You can add new hubcaps. You know what I mean? But primarily speaking, just put it on your car and roll. You know what I mean? I mean, the rest is just a matter of preference. And so I want to say that in the School of the Prophets, we'll be beginning a new series entitled Dominion, the Rise and Fall of Civilization. And in it, we'll be learning the lessons that history, scripture, and political science have to teach us as we work to build a better world today. So many of the things that I mentioned in passing here will be explicated more in depth throughout the course of this seminar series, and we'll be able to go deep into the divine political science that the scriptures teach us, and how it should influence our perspectives on leadership, on personal development, on the role of business and entrepreneurship, on the significance of us reconnecting with the land of Africa, etc. Because we're not just dealing with the Bible, right? We're broadening out to show how the Bible fits into the larger paradigm of world history itself, with a particular emphasis on Africa. So we're talking about different African social systems, how they emerged, why they fell, you know, how the Bible contains so many lessons that are relevant to people who are currently involved in nation-building projects today. You know, advice to African governments to remember the lessons that they've forgotten from their own ancestors even, you know, and how all these things fit together to form the foundation, you know, for the new world that has to come into existence.
Wow. So hallelujah. All right, Keith, let me go home and hurry up and get back to my wife. And we gonna pick
She's
up.
gonna be calling any second now. Whose house are you at? Put her on the phone. Sukatiya, shalom, shalom.
Shalom, shalom.
Don't hurt him, okay?
And shalom, shalom, family. Man, I hope this thing's still working. Oh, this camera is